Have you ever stopped to think about how small decisions can lead to massive revelations? Well, this story begins with an apparently simple test, but it unraveled shocking truths. Imagine a millionaire, powerful and methodical, deciding to test the honesty of his new maid with an unusual strategy, leaving the safe open and setting up a camera to observe every detail. Curious, isn't it? But what he uncovered wasn't just a test of trust. It was the beginning of a journey that unearthed secrets from the past, shook his certainties, and completely transformed his life. Now, before diving into this tale full of twists, ask yourself, how many times has life surprised you with something you never expected? Get ready, because this is the story of how a simple act of vigilance became the most emotional discovery of this man's life, Leoncio Sanchez. The name resonated in the business world as a synonym for success and fortune. At 45 years old, he was the epitome of what many considered an unattainable dream, a millionaire businessman, single, admired for his ability to turn ideas into empires. But if someone looked beyond the glamour and grandeur, they would notice a shadow of loneliness hovering over him. Leoncio, despite having the world at his feet, was a man who ironically didn't know how to open his heart. And isn't that curious? Because life, like one of the most intriguing stories, sometimes gives us everything, except what we truly need. His days were a whirlwind of meetings, negotiations, and decisions. He built dreams for others, but had no time to live his own. Time is money, he often said, but the truth is that this saying hid a high price. Leoncio spent his hours accumulating wealth, but in return lost the connections that made life worthwhile. It's funny to think that he knew every shortcut to financial success, but had no map to emotional happiness. Have you ever seen something like this in your life? Someone who seems to have it all but lives in a silent void, and the people around him, they were fascinating. Envy, admiration, interest, all of it mixed in glances and seemingly genuine smiles. Could he distinguish the false from the real? Maybe yes, maybe no. After all, Leoncio had learned early to trust numbers more than emotions. Numbers don't lie, but they don't comfort, embrace, or understand either. They are cold, while life demands warmth. Who knows, if he paused for a moment and looked around, he might realize that the greatest treasure wasn't in the vault, but in the small daily interactions. Curiously, a man like Leoncio never went unnoticed. He was a walking mystery. Why would someone so successful isolate himself in a cocoon of work and routine? The answer wasn't simple. Perhaps it was armor, protection against something from the past he wasn't ready to confront. Have you ever felt that? The sensation that if you stop, old memories might catch up to you? Well, Leoncio felt it too, and so he followed his meticulous routine, unaware that something was about to break this cycle. Something so small yet so significant that it would completely transform the course of his story. Because in the end, even the most emotionally shielded man must face the surprises life has in store for him. And that's exactly what began to happen when Teresa, his loyal maid, decided to leave. Teresa was almost invisible but indispensable in Leoncio Sanchez's life. For years, she not only maintained order in the luxurious mansion, but also brought a sense of stability that the millionaire never fully appreciated. It was funny to think that, amidst so many financial achievements, Leoncio had never reflected on how much he depended on someone like Teresa to keep his personal life minimally functional. But, as with everything in life, that silent tranquility was about to end. Teresa's announcement came like a bombshell. She wanted to move closer to her family. "Leoncio, my time here is over," she said with the same calm with which she folded his clothes. For anyone else, this would be just a change in routine, but for Leoncio, it was an unexpected blow. He was used to controlling every aspect of his life, and now someone important was leaving the board without his permission. Curious, isn't it? How we sometimes don't realize the value of something until it's about to disappear. The solution? Delegate the hiring of a new maid to Sylvia, his assistant. After all, he didn't have time to deal with such mundane matters. Sylvia found Blanca, a young woman who seemed everything Leoncio didn't expect. Modest, reserved, and in a way intriguing. Blanca was the opposite of what he was accustomed to dealing with. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't seem impressed by his wealth, and there was something in her demeanor that made him suspicious. It was almost as if she had a secret. And of course, Leoncio couldn't simply accept Blanca without reservations. He wasn't the type of person to trust easily, not even in someone with the best references. After all, a man who lives surrounded by opportunists develops a certain paranoia. Can you imagine that? Living with the constant feeling that someone might be deceiving you. With that thought, he decided to test Blanca in a peculiar way, a test that seemed trivial but would reveal much about her. Teresa's departure wasn't just a practical change in the house. It was the start of a small emotional earthquake that Leoncio hadn't yet identified. Because sometimes, the biggest changes begin with the smallest events. And that's exactly what happened when Blanca began working for him. It was only the beginning of a series of events that would change Leoncio's life forever. Leoncio was never a man to leave anything to chance. He firmly believed that trust was something earned, never freely given. So with Blanca's arrival, he decided to put that philosophy into practice. It wasn't personal, of course. It was just Leoncio's calculated way of dealing with people. He left money deliberately on the coffee table, like bait thrown into a pond. And as expected, he discreetly installed a camera to monitor her every move. A bit extreme, perhaps, but Leoncio wasn't willing to take risks, not even in his own home. In the first few days, Blanca seemed impeccable. Her dedication was evident, and she carried out her tasks with almost exaggerated attention to detail. However, something caught Leoncio's attention. During a casual review of the recordings, he saw Blanca taking an apparently insignificant object, an old photograph from an album left in the office. For a man accustomed to reading between the lines, this was more than enough to pique his curiosity. After all, why would someone, especially a newly hired maid, be interested in a faded old photo? Leoncio decided to confront her, but not with anger or direct accusations. He preferred his usual approach, cold, logical, and meticulous. He showed her the recording and calmly asked, "Why did you take this?" Blanca, however, didn't react as most people would. She didn't stammer or try to make excuses. Instead, she looked directly into Leoncio's eyes and said, "Because this photo means something to me." A response so direct and unexpected that it left Leoncio speechless for a brief moment. There was something about Blanca's attitude that didn't fit the profile of someone with bad intentions. Her sincerity had a depth that disarmed Leoncio, even if he didn't want to admit it. He, who always believed in controlling situations, began to realize he was facing an enigma that couldn't be solved with logic alone. It was as if Blanca held a piece of a puzzle he didn't even know existed. A curious detail, don't you think? Sometimes it's in the simplest actions that we find the most complex answers. This discovery left Leoncio restless. For the first time in years, he found himself intrigued by something that wasn't a number on a spreadsheet or a $1 million project. And as Blanca's words echoed in his mind, he knew he couldn't let this go. This seemingly insignificant photograph was more than an image. It was the key to something he didn't yet understand, but was about to discover. The photograph in question was old, worn by time, but it carried a meaning Leoncio couldn't yet grasp. It showed a simple scene, a young Leoncio in a suit beside a woman whose eyes seemed to hold a million stories. This image was part of an album he rarely opened, a relic of a past he preferred to leave untouched. But Blanca, when confronted, revealed something that would completely change Leoncio's perception of himself and his own history. She looked directly at him and said, with a trembling but firm voice, "That woman is my mother, and you are my father." Those words fell like thunder. Leoncio, the man who always had answers for everything, was momentarily speechless. Blanca continued, explaining that her mother, Lure, had kept that secret for years. It was only recently, after finding her mother's diary, that Blanca discovered the truth. Imagine the courage it takes to confront a man so closed off and tell him something like that. Blanca wasn't seeking money or benefits. She was seeking answers. She wanted to know why he had disappeared from her and her mother's life, leaving only this photograph as a memory. Leoncio didn't know what to say. He, who always controlled situations, now found himself in a position of total vulnerability. At first, he tried to deny it, looking for any flaw that might invalidate Blanca's story. But as he looked at the photo again, and at Blanca's features, he began to see the truth that had been in front of him all along. It was as if the photograph, so insignificant until then, now shone with new meaning. It wasn't just an image. It was the missing link to a story he hadn't even known he needed to revisit. Blanca continued to explain what she knew. Her mother had never spoken ill of Leoncio. On the contrary, she always mentioned how determined and ambitious he was. But there was pain in every word she wrote in her diary. Pain from separation, from a love interrupted by forces neither of them seemed to fully understand. For Leoncio, this was a devastating revelation. He, who prided himself on always being in control, now realized that part of his story had slipped through his fingers. Isn't it ironic how even the most meticulous can lose crucial pieces of life's puzzle? And so, in the midst of all that emotional turmoil, Leoncio made a decision. He needed answers, not just to satisfy Blanca's curiosity, but to confront what he himself had avoided for so long. This photograph was the beginning of something bigger, something that would lead him to revisit parts of himself he thought were buried. He didn't know it yet, but this journey would be as transformative as it was unexpected. Looking at the photograph again, memories began to surface in Leoncio's mind, like pages of a book he had closed long ago. Lure, that name brought a wave of conflicting emotions. He remembered her as the woman who, for a brief and intense moment, had been the center of his world. They met in a small town, when Leoncio was not yet the powerful businessman he would become. Back then, he was just a young man full of dreams and ambitions, while Lure was the embodiment of joy and simplicity. An unlikely combination, but undeniably magical. Their relationship, like many great stories, was intense and brief. Leoncio had an unmissable job offer in another city, an opportunity that promised to be the start of everything he had built. Lure, on the other hand, was deeply rooted in her hometown, taking care of her younger sister and running the family's small shop. They made promises to stay in touch, to fight for the love they shared. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. A missed connection here, a lost letter there, and the thread that bound them began to unravel. What Leoncio didn't know, however, was that not everything was destiny's doing. Lure had a sister, Marcella, who always had strong opinions about their relationship. Marcella believed Leoncio was a distraction for Lure, that he would pull her away from her responsibilities and perhaps even hurt her. It was Marcella who intercepted one of Leoncio's letters, a letter in which he proposed that Lure join him in the new city. Unaware of the letter's content, Lure interpreted Leoncio's silence as a sign that he had moved on. Leoncio recalled those moments with a mix of nostalgia and regret. He had convinced himself that the separation was inevitable, that the circumstances were beyond his control. But now, hearing Blanca's story, he realized that perhaps it had all been a matter of communication, or the lack of it. Isn't it ironic how the greatest love stories can be destroyed by something as simple as a lost letter? It made him wonder how many other things in his life he had let slip through his fingers without noticing. And so, he found himself facing a dilemma. Revisiting the past meant confronting not just Lure, but also the mistakes and choices he had made. It would be painful, but he knew he needed to uncover the truth. After all, this wasn't just his and Lure's story anymore. It was also Blanca's story. And like any great narrative, it was about to reach a turning point no one could have foreseen. Blanca had lived a life filled with questions but few answers. Growing up, she always felt there was something unsaid about her origins. Her mother, Lure, was a loving woman but carefully avoided mentioning Blanca's father. It was only when Lure fell ill that Blanca found the diary that held the truth. Each page revealed fragments of a lost love story, marked by unfulfilled promises and the silence that separated them. That diary was more than words. It was the key to a past Blanca was determined to uncover. With her heart torn between pain and curiosity, Blanca decided she needed to find her father. The idea of confronting Leoncio Sanchez, a man so distant from her reality, was daunting. Yet she knew she couldn't live with that void forever. Each step of her journey was guided by a mix of courage and vulnerability. Imagine what it's like to step into the life of someone so powerful and distant, knowing you might not be welcome. Blanca knew she was taking a risk, but sometimes the search for truth demands that we face our greatest fears. When she met Leoncio, Blanca prepared herself for rejection. She knew he might deny everything, accuse her of lying, or assume she had ulterior motives. But the honesty with which she shared her story disarmed Leoncio. She spoke about her childhood, how she grew up without a father, and how she discovered the truth through Lure's diary. Her narrative was simple but loaded with emotion, and it's fascinating how, in moments like this, sincerity can achieve what no logical argument ever could. It touched his heart. Blanca also had to confront her own emotions. She wasn't just there to confront Leoncio, but also to understand her mother. Why hadn't Lure tried to contact him? Why had she chosen to keep this secret for so many years? Every answer Blanca sought wasn't just to fill gaps in her own story, but also to honor her mother's memory. It's remarkable how sometimes the search for truth becomes a way of giving voice to those who can no longer speak. And as Blanca looked at Leoncio, waiting for his answers, he knew he needed to act. There was no more running from what was in front of him. This young woman, who had faced so many uncertainties to find him, deserved more than vague explanations. She deserved the truth, and Leoncio knew that truth began with a visit to the past, a visit that would take him back to Lure and the story he never finished. The journey of Leoncio and Blanca brought them to Lure's door, a place where memories and emotions long buried awaited to be unearthed. When Lure opened the door and her eyes met Leoncio's, time seemed to stand still. She had changed, as everyone does over the years, but there was still something unmistakable in her gaze, a mix of surprise, pain, and perhaps hope. Leoncio felt a lump in his throat. He, who always controlled every word and gesture, didn't know how to begin speaking. In that moment, silence seemed more eloquent than any speech. Blanca, sensing the tension, took the initiative. With the calmness of someone who knows they carry a greater mission, she explained how she had discovered her parents' story. Lure listened silently, her hands trembling slightly as she held a cup of tea. When Blanca finished, Lure finally spoke, her voice laden with emotion. She confirmed the story but added something Leoncio hadn't expected, the interference of her sister Marcella. It was Marcella who had sabotaged the letters, planted doubt, and destroyed what could have been a future together. Leoncio felt a wave of emotions he didn't know how to process. Anger, certainly. Regret, without a doubt. But there was also a deep sense of loss, as if he had let something precious slip through his fingers without realizing it. He looked at Lure, searching for words to make amends for the past, but he realized there was no way to turn back time. "If I had known," he began, but Lure interrupted him. "Leoncio, there's no use lamenting what's gone. What matters is what we do moving forward." The conversation deepened, revealing the layers of hurt and love that still existed between them. It wasn't easy for either of them. Lure confessed that she never wanted to keep Blanca from her father, but didn't know how to find Leoncio after he disappeared from her life. It was as if every word spoken was an attempt to rebuild a bridge that had been burned. Slowly they began to understand that, despite everything, the love they had shared still existed, even if buried beneath years of silence and resentment. As the night wore on, something began to shift in the air. The tension gave way to a sense of redemption. Lure looked at Leoncio and Blanca, and a small smile appeared on her face. "Perhaps it's time we start a new story," she said, with the serenity that only time can bring. And while there was much to resolve, that moment marked the beginning of something new, something that could finally fill the gaps of a story that had been left unfinished. The meeting with Lure was a turning point for Leoncio. For the first time in years, he felt something that couldn't be measured by numbers or reports, the strength of family bonds. Back at his mansion, he reflected on everything that had happened. Blanca, his daughter, was there, and he was finally beginning to understand the depth of what that meant. It wasn't just about responsibility, but about love, a love he had never learned to express. He decided then that he didn't want to be just a provider, but a present father and a companion in her life. Leoncio started with small gestures. He set aside time to talk to Blanca, to truly listen to her. He discovered she had dreams, fears, and a sense of humor that reminded him of Lure. They began sharing moments that seemed simple but carried deep meaning for Leoncio. Imagine a man who had spent years living to accumulate wealth, now learning to appreciate a shared breakfast or a conversation about Blanca's stories. It was like rediscovering what truly matters in life. But he knew there was more to do. His relationship with Lure was still a delicate territory. He sought her out again, this time with an open heart and without the barriers he had built over the years. Leoncio asked for forgiveness, not just for the lost letters or the time apart, but for not fighting hard enough in the past. Lure, in turn, showed the grace of someone who had learned to forgive. They began rebuilding their connection, step by step, with the understanding that the past couldn't be changed, but the future was still unwritten. Blanca was the link that kept this new dynamic moving forward. She became the bridge between Leoncio and Lure, encouraging both to set aside their grievances and focus on what they could build together. Leoncio's mansion, once cold and lonely, began to come alive. Laughter, conversations, and even small arguments filled the halls. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was something Leoncio never imagined he could have again, a real family. Over time, Leoncio realized that money and success, though important, weren't the ultimate purpose of his life. He now understood that his true wealth lay in the relationships he was cultivating. And as he looked at Blanca and Lure, he knew that finally he was living a story worth telling. A story of redemption, reconciliation, and a new beginning that no one could have predicted. Life is full of opportunities to start anew, but not everyone has the courage to seize them. This story teaches us that no matter how lost someone may seem, there is always a path to redemption and reconnection with what truly matters. And now I ask you, are you willing to look at your own story and ask yourself what truly needs to change? What parts of your life are you overlooking without realizing their value? Don't let routine consume you, nor let time distance you from those you love. What will you do today to reconnect with your priorities? Reflect on that. And if you want to keep learning valuable lessons like this, subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and don't miss our upcoming videos, because every story we share here can be the starting point for transforming your own life.